Hare Krishna. Vancha kalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhyevacha patitanam pavnebhyo vaishnavibhyo namo namaha. Hare Krishna. I'd like to welcome everyone for this discussion on a very important topic of reading Srila Prabhupada's books every day, its significance in our personal spiritual life, and how it is contributing to the growth of ISKCON over the last 5 decades, and what is its significance going to be moving forward in the growth of ISKCON. For this discussion today, I have the privilege of inviting His Holiness Guru Prasad Maharaj. Guru Prasad Maharaj is a disciple of His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada. He's been associated with ISKCON for many, many decades. Maharaj is a GBC, Governing Body Commissioner, member of ISKCON, and has been preaching and expanding the Krishna conscious movement in many countries of the world, including some of the challenging geographies in South America. Maharaj, I'd like to welcome you for this discussion. Thank you so much for joining us today, Maharaj.
Thank you for engaging me.
Maharaj, over the many years that you're associated with this movement and reading Srila Prabhupada's books, what has been your inspiration from Srila Prabhupada's words or instructions that has kept you at it unfailingly for so many years?
Well, I think that could be the topic of the whole interview, but I was just thinking of one particular verse which illustrates and indicates the importance of hearing and the importance of transcendental literature, which is the first canto, 3rd chapter, text number 40 of the Bhagavatam. One of my favorite verses, Idam Bhagavatam Nama Puranam Brahma Samhitam. That this Srimad Bhagavatam is Brahma Samhitam. It is the literary incarnation of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, which gives us the greatest impetus, because even Chaitanya Charitamrita, which is more, considered to be deeper into Rasa Tattva and so many different understandings, is based on the Bhagavatam and Bhagavad Gita. And then the verse says, Uttama Shloka Charitam Chakara Bhagavan Rishihi. It is so perfect because it has been given to us by the incarnation of Godhead, Srila Vyasadeva, as all of our Vedic literatures and every book that Srila Prabhupada has given us is either from Vyasadeva or a commentary on that which comes from Vyasadeva. And Nrishaya Saya Lokasya, it is the greatest benefit for humanity. It is Danyam Swastyayanam Mahat. It brings all success. It brings you all, it's all types of bliss and transcendental happiness. And it is the maximum manifestation of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So this has always been my impetus, knowing that here is Krishna. Just like Srila Prabhupada said in the Holy Name, explaining the Holy Name one time, here is Radha, here is Krishna, here is Vrindavan. So we know that, but how do we know about Vrindavan? How do we know about Radharani? How do we know about Krishna? It's all from Srila Prabhupada's books. It's all from these transcendental literatures. And of course, some devotees have translated further things to help us understand even more details. And there's unlimited details. So anyway, this is one of my inspirations.
Maharaj, I never really focused on the words that you just described. When the last line you said, it's the maximum manifestation, Lord Shri Krishna. Uh, it's it's quite a mouthful. I mean, that one statement, maximum manifestation. Uh, Maharaj, when one comes across such words and glorification of Srimad Bhagavatam, there are various ways to relate to such words. Often, devotees who are engaging in the practice of devotional service and trying to become devotees, we hear such glorious words about Srimad Bhagavatam and the purpose of Srila Prabhupada. But it sort of comes in, but does not stay. And we're not able to fully realize the maximum benefit of these words. What is it that one has to do to move from the stage of just listening to these words to the point where one actually starts to really appreciate them in the deep core of their heart and starts to transform one's life as one starts to read Bhagavatam step by step?
Well, of course, Srila Prabhupada said the beginning is ABCD is Bhagavad Gita, which may have been ABCD for Prabhupada. It's more like XYZ for most of us. Arjuna heard it in 45 minutes, and maybe in 45 lifetimes I'll be able to understand it. But by Krishna's grace and by Arjuna's grace and Srila Prabhupada's grace. So the Bhagavatam, as it says in the very beginning, is full of nectar, and it's authorized because it's Krishna Prashnas. It's speaking about Krishna. These questions are about Krishna. So just like I always tell devotees, they always ask me, how can I chant better? I say, if you hear about Krishna at night, which previously in all of our temples in the 70s, the 60s, and well, 60s not so much, but 70s, in all of the temples, we sat down with a glass of milk and a cupcake or something and heard Krishna book for 45 minutes. That was like standard, every temple, and unless you had some big engagement or something. So what does that do? It fills the consciousness with, so just like Prahlad Maharaj says, Shravanam Kirtanam. So when the Shravanam comes in the proper way, hearing about Krishna's pastimes and about Krishna's glories and about Krishna's qualities, then in the morning, you feel very enlivened. If the last thing you do in the day is Facebook or something else or a GBC meeting or whatever it may be, council meeting, then the next morning you'll be thinking about meeting and some issue. So therefore, I always encourage devotees that to make, one time a devotee told me, I said, let's read the Bhagavatam. So we sat down, started reading, and he said, yes, but I want to focus on reality. And I said, oh, Bhagavatam is not reality. So many times I've seen when I'm traveling in an airplane that they have an article in the airplane magazine. They have articles about different people and what they do. And so, a couple of times I just out of boredom after you've chanted, an 8-hour flight or a 15-hour flight, I just start leafing through and I find some personality and I read for some time about that personality. And then there's interest. And the more you read about the person, they did this, he did that, he established this institution or such and such. I remember my mother was very much against Krishna consciousness. But then one day I left the Lilamrita out and she began to read it. And she actually read, I think, most of the Lilamrita. And she said, although I really don't understand your religion and I'm not practicing it, but this man was very glorious, Srila Prabhupada. So when we hear about Krishna and when we see how Srila Prabhupada is transforming our lives, transforming our existence, even though it may not sink in the beginning. Just like we all go to school, we've had the experience, we all go to school, we hear so many things, and it doesn't sink in right away. But that's what we have, homework, and after some time, the knowledge accumulates, and then you feel grateful. Just like I think most young people experience that when you're 5 or 6 years old, you don't want to go to school. And maybe even for the whole course of the study time, you don't, but afterwards, when you feel the benefit, then you become very appreciative. Just like Srila Prabhupada gave the example of playing the piano. If we play the piano, in the beginning, it's arduous, but after you do it for some time, it flows and it becomes very enjoyable. So everything is like that. And hearing about Krishna and Srila Prabhupada and our acharyas and great saintly persons in the Bhagavatam and Chaitanya Charitamrita. I was just reading a few days ago, Srila Prabhupada said, and when just after he had finished the Nectar of Devotion, he said, "This work is most important. You should read it once, twice, thrice, until you understand all of these devotional principles, and they become, I don't know the exact words, but like they become a reality in your life." He said, Rupa Goswami has given this. Actually, it has been given by Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to Rupa Goswami for 10 days. So now I am giving this to you. So this is, it's that repetition is very wonderful.
Maharaj, you used that Srila Prabhupada is giving this to us. He used it in the present tense. And yes, it really touches the heart when one uses it in the present tense. Srila Prabhupada himself said that he is living through his books forever. He will live through his books forever. So that's a statement. And then there is this whole talk about Srila Prabhupada being the preeminent Siksha Guru, Srila Prabhupada being the founder Acharya of ISKCON. And then there is what you just expressed in absolute present tense, Srila Prabhupada is giving us. What is the significance of Srila Prabhupada's Bhaktivedanta purports in making us have the same sort of mood and attitude where we also feel every moment of our life that Prabhupada is giving us? What role does his books play in reaching that stage of realization?
Just like all of us know and accept if we're in Krishna consciousness, no matter if one is reading or not reading, we all accept the fact that Krishna is within the heart. He's there. He's instructing it. He's instructing the ducks how to swim. He's doing everything for every living entity. And so we feel that Krishna is there. Krishna is the present tense. It's not that Krishna appeared 5,000 years ago, demonstrated some pastimes, and he's gone. And so in the same way, an acharya, actually Srila Prabhupada expresses in the 10th canto, the 2nd chapter, that the acharyas, they leave behind these literatures, which are the boat that takes us from the material world to the spiritual world. And then Prabhupada poses the question, well, how does the boat get back? Otherwise, you take the boat, how does it get back? And that's why they leave the transcendental literatures, because they're always available to take us. It's not the one boat that has to come and go. So this is it's present tense. Everything in Krishna consciousness is present tense. On the spiritual platform, there's no past or future. It's all happening. And we actually should realize that we're taking place. We're part of the ongoing Bhagavatam. Every day the Bhagavatam is being presented in maybe 500 or 1,000 different places, and with with a unique explanation. So the Bhagavatam is living and growing, and this is all done by hearing.
Yes. Maharaj, you a little while ago you gave us a glimpse into what life was. You said in the 70s, practically in every center, devotees would at night sit down and read Krishna book and immerse themselves in reading Prabhupada's books. Can you share more with us about what the culture was in the 70s or in those early days when Srila Prabhupada was personally present with respect to his books and reading them?
Yes, Srila Prabhupada said again and again, you have to read my books. He said, if my disciples don't read my books, they will fall down. That's how important it is. Just like we have basically three levels of of, uh, of of expression, and those three levels of expression are addressed in Bhagavad Gita, where Maya or lust can enter on the platform of the senses, the mind, and the intellect. So, therefore, for our helping our external senses, we have practical, active devotional service. To help us control the mind, we have the holy name. And to also help us focus the mind and to stimulate the intelligence, Yatma Suprasidati. Srila Prabhupada says satisfying the self, and Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says satisfying the intellect. So, so these books are to satisfy the intellect, to get the intellect focused on Krishna, to keep the intellect pure and free from false ego, because otherwise our intellect has the tendency to increase our false ego. But if we stimulate the intellect with the knowledge of Srila Prabhupada's books, then the intellect becomes a servant and doesn't want to become the king.
And Maharaj, in those days when Prabhupada was present, uh, how often were devotees reading Prabhupada's books? Was it at the very center of their lives? Were the temple presidents emphasizing on it? Were devotees who were not reading being encouraged to read? Can you share some glimpse into what was happening in those days?
Well, I can remember a couple of instances. Once, one devotee asked told Srila Prabhupada that, Prabhupada, you told us to read 2 hours a day. So, as a minimum, of course, just like 16 rounds is a minimum, so it was a minimum. And Prabhupada said, but I have so much service, Prabhupada, I don't find the time to do so. And Prabhupada said, this is why I have established Srimad Bhagavatam and Bhagavad Gita. So this is reading, this is hearing. And Prabhupada said, still you must study. You must study. And Prabhupada actually wanted the ashrams to be educational. When he spoke, every time he spoke to the Indian government, he says, I am establishing this educational system for systematic understanding of the Bhagavad philosophy. And, how important are books? Well, Bhaktivinoda Thakur wrote over 100 books. Rupa Goswami, Srila Prabhupada said, the 6 Goswamis, they dedicated their time to writing, chanting, and dancing. And so, and Prabhupada said, dancing is very good. But in order to dance properly, you also have to hear. I remember in Mayapur, 1976, in the festival, devotees were dancing very wildly, very, very wildly. And Prabhupada stopped and he said, you must learn how to dance for the pleasure of Krishna. So all these things, the gravity of devotional service is established. Otherwise, we have a tendency to be very sentimental and just accept those things that are pleasing to ourselves. But when we actually, understand things from the focal point of Srila Prabhupada's books, then everything becomes very clear. Everything is balanced. So in those days, devotees, we would have, just like when I first came, we had 5 classes a day. We had
5 classes a day.
yeah,
Wow.
we had in the morning Srimad Bhagavatam, and
Yes.
then we had mantra reciting, and then we went out for Sankirtan, and then we had after the Bhagavatam class we had a short nectar of instruction class, and then in the evening we had Bhagavad Gita class, nectar of devotion class, and then at the end of the day Krishna book. So it was basically 5
Wow.
classes a day.
Wow.
And still 8
So,
hours of Sankirtan.
so it was essentially what you described. I mean, Srila Prabhupada wasn't just mentioning it to the Indian government. This is what was happening, and he wanted it to happen. That
Yeah.
his students and his disciples were reading. That's extraordinary, Maharaj. That's really extraordinary what you're sharing with us with respect to the culture then. And Maharaj, I'm intrigued to ask you, do you recall your very first contact with Srila Prabhupada's books, when and how it happened?
Yes. 2 occasions. First occasion was at the University of Texas, and I saw the devotees chanting there. I thought they were Mongolian exchange students because I'd only seen in movies Mongolians with a big ponytail. So, so I observed them, and I thought, they're too strange, and so I went back to my apartment, and I can't remember if it was that day or the next day that Vishnu Jan Swami came to my apartment, knock on the door, and he gave me a BTG. And by his charisma, he took all my money, which wasn't very much. He was a student, and so I had the BTG, and I saw the picture of Vishnu. It was a 4-armed Vishnu, uh, probably Mahavishnu, floating. And I thought, who is this person? And then I saw Prabhupada on the back, and I said, I seem to know this person. I felt an identification immediately. But then the devotees left. I couldn't find them again. And then I got drafted into the army. And the next exposure was I went to the library. I was very frustrated being in the army. It wasn't my inclination. And so I went to the library to find something stimulating to read. And I found the old blue version of Bhagavad Gita. And I sat down and I read it from cover to cover. I didn't go to any of the activities. They chastised me severely. I didn't go to any of the daily activities. I just read Bhagavad Gita. And it was and then I remembered the devotees, and that was so wonderful. And I felt so grateful to Srila Prabhupada. I already had a Bhagavad Gita written by a Mayavad. And after I read Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita, I just took that Bhagavad Gita and put that back in the same place in the library and kept Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita.
Maharaj, what years was this, your first contact with the Back to Godhead magazine, and then when you entered the library?
That was 1971, and the library was 1973.
2 years apart.
Mm-hmm.
Maharaj, do you still recall, you shared something with us about your first experience when you looked at Lord Vishnu probably lying down and Srila Prabhupada, you could immediately stop, you felt an identification. Do you recall anything that you read which left an impact on your heart or inspired you to, move forward and think more or get in touch with the devotees?
Well, I didn't read much of the BTG. I more or less looked at it, and then someone stole it, which was very good because they got the opportunity to hear about Krishna, and so but I just remember just reading the first paragraph of Srila Prabhupada's introduction in Bhagavad Gita. I was totally convinced that this is it. This is what I've been looking for. This is the perfection of yoga, because I was practicing yoga from Paramahansa Yogananda, and I had already been initiated. So I was just so happy that that this, I found the real understanding of the absolute truth.
Yes. Maharaj, that was almost 50 years ago. And in 1973, and subsequently, you shared there were 5 classes, devotees would sit around and read every day. What has your observation been of ISKCON, how this whole culture of reading over the last 50 years, how has it transformed? And perhaps where you are, given how emphatically you feel about it, I'm sure it's still in place, but the observations elsewhere may not be similar now in our temples, etc. Could you share some of your observations of what you're seeing, and also share with us what would have caused a change in culture one way or the other?
Hmm. Well, of course, at that time we were an ashram movement. Now we're a congregational movement. Of course, we still have ashrams, but only in India really are the ashrams full and vibrant. There may be a few here or there, but really the ashram life is not as popular as it was in those days. But Srila Prabhupada said, every grihasta, if you want to be successful, your house must be an ashram. Lord Chaitanya told the Kurma Brahmin that Jari Dekatari Kaha Krishnu Padesha Maragyaya Guru Hanyatara Desh. He was instructing him that if you really want to be a Brahmin, if you really want to be a devotee, then you must make your house into a temple. And everyone around that you meet, you should, whatever you know, whatever you've been able to understand, you must give it to them. So Lord Chaitanya was encouraging us to hear, to live in a purified atmosphere, and to share that with others. Just like anyone who preaches, if you preach Krishna consciousness, to whatever level you can, maybe explaining to someone, then your reading will increase and the quality will increase, because you have to know what to say and you have to know how to present it. And what is the best way? We hear from Srila Prabhupada. If you hear from Srila Prabhupada, you see his systematic presentation of Krishna consciousness. How in the small books he addressed so many issues with the realizations that he got from being in contact with Western devotees, Western people, and Western devotees. So it's such a it's just like I always recommend to devotees that the best way, and I've found this for myself, the best way to study, if you want to remember something, then you inquire to yourself, what is it I really want to know about? Do I want to know about hearing? Do I want to know about chanting? Do I want to? And then you look that up and it will stick with you for the rest of your life. But still, there has to be systematic study. But that is the way you really want something to enter into your heart. And another thing that I always recommend, which everybody recommends and Rupa Goswami recommends, is and Lord Kapila Dev in Bhagavatam, he tells us Satam Prasangam Mama Virya Samvido Bhavanti Karna Rasayana Kata, that you must hear in the association of devotees. So when we read Prabhupada's books, we're in the association of Srila Prabhupada. And if we remember that, then it becomes so much more meaningful. We shouldn't just pick up the Bhagavatam or Bhagavad Gita or Chaitanya Charitamrita and like we were reading another book, like we're reading some novel or some book that we have to read and study. But the Bhagavatam, the Bhagavad Gita, all of these literatures are alive. They're alive, and when we remember that this is the living Bhagavatam, this is the living Chaitanya Charitamrita, here is Srila Prabhupada, who's painstakingly took the time and made the effort to give me this possibility, this doorway, this portal to the spiritual world. If we remember all these aspects of this wonderful transcendental literature, then it becomes so much more meaningful. If you just pick it up and say, well, I'm supposed to read. If you say anything, I have to, or I'm supposed to, then it becomes a struggle. But if you think, if our mindset is, now I have the opportunity, I have this by Krishna's grace, by Srila Prabhupada's grace, this Bhagavatam is here. Where would the Western world be if Prabhupada wouldn't have come? There would be no Bhagavatam. There would be no Chaitanya. Even if they existed in India, most of us would have never found it. And most people in India, even though they were in India, they never found it. And Prabhupada made the Bhagavatam available to every person in every part of the world. So when we remember what someone has done, whenever we feel grateful, when we remember what someone has done for us. So the more we remember what Srila Prabhupada did, how he sacrificed his life, when everybody was telling him, stay in Vrindavan, don't go there to the land of the mleches, don't, you could die on the way. And Prabhupada didn't care because of his compassion. And that compassion is feeding us spiritually and helping us grow.
Maharaj, now that I have the opportunity to hear from you, inspiring us about Srimad Bhagavatam, I feel quite enlivened because you touched upon a very important aspect of what should be our mood when we approach the literature, Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, Chaitanya Charitamrita, and the literature that Srila Prabhupada has given us as a portal to the spiritual world. Maharaj, in your travels, in your discussions with devotees, what are some of the unhealthy attitudes or moods that we must avoid so that we do not get caught up and lose this opportunity to enter into the living Bhagavatam and the living Chaitanya Charitamrita? You touched upon one, which is never have this notion of I have to or I'm supposed to. Are there others that you have come across that are unhealthy for us to keep in our heart?
Yes. The kind of association we keep, of course, if one is working in the outside world, one may have to associate with people. But Prabhupada said, we don't take their association, we give them association. Not that I'm feeling that I'm something great, but I'm feeling that I've been given the opportunity to be the transporter of the mercy, by the mercy of Srila Prabhupada and his devotees. I have the opportunity to bring this transcendental knowledge. Not that I'm giving them my association, I'm giving them Prabhupada's association. And that helps us, just like when I was first in Krishna consciousness, I was in the army. And I found that it wasn't very nice. But it became very nice because I took refuge in Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam, and the Chaitanya Charitamrita. The only thing that was available at that time was Lord Chaitanya and 5 features, the translation of the 7th chapter of Adi Lila. And it was my refuge. And not only that, because I was in touch with the devotees and they recommended that I do Sankirtan, when I started distributing the books to the soldiers and people, the whole atmosphere changed. So the more we hear and the more we give the other people opportunities, just like in the Bhagavatam, it says Vasudeva Kata Prashna Purusham Strin Punatihi Bhaktaram Prachtatam Shrotrims Tatsada Shalinam Yata. That there are 3 people that benefit from the hearing of this transcendental literature: the speaker, the hearer, and the audience. So it's just so wonderful when the Bhagavatam is recited, when we read. This is something that I always encourage because most devotees now, they live at their home. Don't see your home as a refuge from Krishna, but see it as, like this is the place where I can do what I want. In the temple, I have to do what they say. But see it as Krishna's palace, Krishna's uh, ashram, where I'm supposed to glorify him. And the audience, I have my audience, my wife, my children, my husband, whatever our position may be, my father. We should feel that this is our temple. And then we should hear together, because hearing together is so much more powerful. Because then the whole spirit, all of our transcendental literature is questions and answers. Krishna instructs us in Bhagavad Gita that Tadvidi pranipatena parishprashnena sevaya, that we should always be inquiring. So I always recommend to devotees, don't create the unhealthy atmosphere that now I got home from work, let me switch on the TV, watch a movie, because that tendency is there because I've been working hard, I've been associating with material nature. But once you actually find the comfort of sitting with one's family and picking up one of Prabhupada's books, some transcendental literature, and hearing, is so much more purifying, and it's actually satisfying. And when the children see that we're doing this together, they develop a taste for hearing. They develop it, and so this is, if the children see that my parents say, "Oh, you should chant, and you should do this, you should believe in Krishna, and give me some coloring book and some Krishna game or something," that's one thing. But the more that they see me relishing, the father, the mother, they see us relishing this Bhagavatam, relishing the chanting of the holy name, then they become inspired.
Yes. And as you described, Maharaj, then every home can become a temple, and it can become a refuge, not away from Krishna, but a refuge which Krishna offers us to be able to sustain ourselves in Krishna consciousness. Sometimes devotees ask this question, which is, they say that actually these books, they're philosophically very intense. And they say, for children, can we give them some other books? Do you have some, other books which are children-like books? This is a common question. Even at the Ministry of Education, we sometimes get approached and devotees ask, do you have something for children? Whereas I always feel bewildered. Why not the Bhagavad Gita? Why not the Srimad Bhagavatam? Why not the Chaitanya Charitamrita? Why does this arise, Maharaj? Why does this tendency to deliberately dumb down our intelligence and that of our children arise? And what should one do to overcome this nature of dumbing ourselves down and our children along with us, by saying that, unless they're like 15 years or 24 years old, they should not touch the Bhagavad Gita or Bhagavatam? What should one do, Maharaj?
One time Srila Prabhupada gave a class in the early years, and he just read, I can't remember what it was, but he just read the Sanskrit. And then he told the devotees after like 20 minutes, even though you may not understand the potency of, I think, I can't remember if it was the Bhagavatam. I think it was Janmastami, and Prabhupada was reading from the 10th canto, but he was just reading the Sanskrit verses. And Prabhupada says, so there are several considerations. First of all, if the children are very young, like 5 years or less, okay, you get a coloring book, you get, you hold them in your lap. And I found, I see in Christian churches and mosques, people come to the mosque or the church for the mass or the service, and they have small children. And the children, I remember my father would take me to church, and I had to sit there and listen. And it wasn't I always felt it was something sacred, even though I may not have understood. So I think children over 5 years can hear. And then, of course, there can be times when you're reading with the children, and there can be times when you're reading among adults, and with the children, you may read Krishna book, or you may even get some Mahabharata or something. But when you're reading together, it should be, this thing about philosophically difficult. It's meant to be philosophically difficult to stimulate ourselves to ask questions, to inquire, to understand anything. Just like if I go into a physics class or a English literature or language class, immediately everything is foreign, everything is difficult. But as I progress, it becomes progressively more understandable. Just like I remember so many things in first time I read Bhagavad Gita and first time I read Srimad Bhagavatam, so many doubts, and still Bhagavatam, there are parts of it that are difficult to understand even for the most seasoned student. But that should stimulate us. So one recommendation is that what I do in my own reading, I don't just read one book. Although there may be one book I'm focusing on more than another. But I always try to read some Bhagavad Gita, some Bhagavatam, some Chaitanya Charitamrita, and then, at least once or twice a week, nectar devotion, nectar of instruction, because you can never tire. Just like Arjuna says in the 10th canto, that Krishna, hearing you again and again, I'm never satiated. So you're never satiated. Like Prabhupada said about chanting, you can say some word, water, 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 but it doesn't satisfy you. But when you chant the holy name, the same thing with hearing from Prabhupada's books, the more you do it, the more it becomes relishable.
Maharaj, within your answer, you already addressed a question that was arising in my mind, which often comes up where devotees have this notion, which is, I've already read. I've read Bhagavad Gita, I've read Bhagavatam, so why do I have to do again? But you've answered that, and you said that actually, if one truly reads with the mood that you described earlier in the conversation, then one would be inspired to read again and again because one relishes it so much. Maharaj, and you also touched upon this very important aspect of creating a culture of hearing within the household, within the temple, etc. Maharaj, this is so important. This is so important. Now, in many parts of ISKCON, in our temples and centers, there are leaders and devotees who are very busy. They have upon their shoulders, or sometimes they take upon their shoulders a lot of services, a lot of commitments as managers and leaders. And if we ask them or if we inquire from them about the reading, they say, where is the time? They say, this service is more important than anything else. Maharaj, you're a GBC member, you've been a manager, you've done so much and you continue to do. What would your word of caution or message be to the leaders who for sometimes months, weeks, or maybe years do not prioritize reading Prabhupada's books daily? What could happen to our spiritual lives?
Well, as I've said in the beginning, Prabhupada said, if you don't read my books, you will fall down. So I think we should take that very seriously. In 1970, Srila Prabhupada asked in a class, after, I don't know, it was after or during, but he asked Nandarani Devi Dasi, are you chanting the rounds? And she said, I tried to. And Prabhupada, he was not happy. And of course, later she revealed that actually the temple authorities told her that the most important thing is to do your service. But Prabhupada says in Madhya Lila, chapter 22, text 113 in the purport, of all the instructions of the spiritual master, chanting 16 rounds is the most important. And Prabhupada, a little later, he spoke to his secretary and said, this is the problem. They are not chanting properly and they are not hearing properly. So, especially for leaders, they must, how do you lead if in the beginning of the Bhagavatam, it says, this is the sword by which we can cut the knot of the chain of fruitive activities. So, how can you fight a battle without the sword? How can you lead people on the progressive path back home, back to Godhead, if you don't have the sword? Just like one of our swords, of course, is the chanting of the holy name. But the sword mentioned in the Bhagavatam itself is transcendental literature. Because without transcendental literature, how will we have quality in our chanting? In the beginning, we've seen films of Srila Prabhupada, he's dancing and chanting, and everybody's going like this, and, a sentimental, maybe semi-drug induced state of euphoria. But as soon as they walk out the door, the euphoria stops. And so we can't see the Bhagavatam, we can't see hearing Srila Prabhupada's books as something I do, and then I go to something else. But it's the fuel, it's the inspiration. Just like Srila Prabhupada said, that the farther down you are in the parampara, the more fortunate you are. Just like if you're a follower, just like in the Adi Purana, Krishna tells Arjuna that my best devotee is not someone who says he's my devotee, but who says he's the devotee of my devotee. So this is the mood we should feel, that I'm so fortunate. We have Rupa Goswami, Sanatana Goswami, Jiva Goswami. They gave all these literatures, and Srila Prabhupada has handpicked the most essential things, seeing what the people need in this age of Kali, in this, basically speaking, Srila Prabhupada came at the time when there was a transformation in society of just emphasizing sense gratification. It was like, before that, in every society, even in America, everything, there was like a real sense of duty. But it was like in the 1960s, the idea was no more duty, just enjoy peace and love. And Prabhupada came at that time when this hedonistic, emphasis came into the worldwide society, and he tailored his books to deal with that.
Very critical juncture, historically speaking. One cannot even imagine where the world would have gone, or at least the lives of those who joined Prabhupada's movement would have gone without course correction, or the path being shown. I mean, the way you put it, it seems like a very critical juncture, Maharaj. So, Maharaj, you said that for leaders, especially, it's extremely important. And when you're speaking, Maharaj, it's coming with so much potency. It's coming. The question seems like a redundant question when I ask you. It's like, oh, come on, how is this even an applicable question? So I apologize. I apologize because because these are the notions that we come across in our heart and amongst while talking to devotees around in ISKCON. These are the notions that we come across. What are the notions? We have to prioritize our chanting over everything else, which is a fact. But then there's only that happens. Then nothing else happens. There's no reading, nothing else. Then there's this notion amongst devotees, not everywhere, but in some cases, that other services are more important. In fact, there is this very strong notion that if one just engages in the service, which is assigned to one, then that service is enough, even if one doesn't do it. But you have very thankfully shared firsthand what happened with Nandarani Mataji and other instances. Maharaj, if you had to give a message to the devotees in ISKCON, which uh, firmly and squarely puts the point across about reading every day, what would your, it's very difficult. I know it's difficult to say one line or two line, but something that you like to share as parting words from your side to the leaders and devotees in general. Well, there's one question, of course, I was very curious to ask, which is, what impact has reading Prabhupada's books every day had on your personal spiritual life? And I'm almost tempted to ask, is there anything in the world for which you're willing to trade it for?
I couldn't think of trading it, but just like a standard motorized car has oil and gasoline. So every day my oil and gasoline are chanting the holy name and hearing Srila Prabhupada's books. And my recommendation is, especially if you're busy, do it before your business starts. Chant, but make sure you hear something every day. What I try to do every day is, if I'm in a temple, I take the Bhagavatam verse of that day and try to see how to apply it in my daily activities. But if you're living, sometimes when I'm in my own little ashram and there's no class or something, I just pick a verse from the Bhagavatam, from either what I'm reading or sometimes Chaitanya Charitamrita, and I try to meditate, how can I apply this to my day? And especially Bhagavad Gita, because they're practical instructions. How can I apply this to my day? So that's one thing I did want to mention. We should understand the importance of Srila Prabhupada's books, especially when he was lecturing in India. So he would have a deity on the stage. So one time they put the deity, but another thing which he always had was a collection of his books. And so one day they had the deity. Prabhupada said, "Where are the books?" The books are the deity. No. So this was the real deity for Srila Prabhupada. So that just shows how important these books, and just, if I want to give a message, I noted this down. I'm going to read it. This is what Srila Prabhupada said. I just have to, just 1 second, open this up. I think this is very, very, there was a devotee who went out on Sankirtan, and he asked Srila Prabhupada for his blessing, Srila Prabhupada's blessing. And let's see if I can find that. I wrote it down here. Yeah. So Prabhupada said, he had a new book that had just come out. And Prabhupada said, "So you have read?" And he said, "Oh no, Srila Prabhupada." And Prabhupada said, "How will you convince them? No, how will you convince them to read this if you have not read it?" And then Prabhupada said, "I have written these books for you." This is what Prabhupada said. This is the main thing wasn't even to distribute them. So in a class the next day, this is what Srila Prabhupada said: "Read Krishna book regularly. Why these books are written? Only for selling? Taking statistics? How many books have you sold?" Otherwise, Prabhupada is saying, this is statistics. You learn, read, always read 24 hours. As soon as you get time, read. I do that. I do that. Reading, writing, or chanting. But when there is no other way, you sleep little. Not to enjoy sleep, because it is not possible to continue. All right, sleep 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, not more than that. So it's very clear.
Very powerful.
I wanted us to read his books.
Yes, couldn't get clearer than that. Maharaj, I wanted to ask you one last question, which is, you said we are all, some of us can be busy. People do get busy. But there's also a tendency to continue to remain busy sometimes. And for longer durations of the day, and perhaps also longer durations of our life than what is necessary. When should we, Prabhupada said that, Prabhupada writes in his books that one must reorganize one's life, irrespective of whether one is a renounced devotee or a householder. One must reorganize one's life to be able to practice Krishna consciousness, which is Shravanam Kirtanam. What would your advice be to the busy householders, to the busy everyone? Because there's this tendency to remain busy for, for a long time, practically when one leg is in the grave already. So
Prabhupada wanted us to be busy, but busyness means, Prabhupada said, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu Kirtaniya Sada Hari, we should always be busy. And the Bhagavatam, it says that we should always be meditating on Lord Chaitanya. But just like in our diet, we don't just take vitamins. We don't just take proteins. If there's not a balance, then you can take all the vitamins you want, which are very good for you. But without the balance, it will create an imbalance in your life, and you'll get sick. So yes, keep busy, but part of that busyness is very eagerly hearing from Srila Prabhupada's books, very eagerly chanting the holy name, very eagerly doing what we have to do. And with the proper balance, we get the right diet. Prabhupada said our diet is Krishna Prasadam, and our medicine is the holy name.
yes. And our meditation is Srimad Bhagavatam, as we heard from you today, Maharaj. Maharaj, I'm so grateful for your time today. And I really look forward to another opportunity to be able to hear more from you on this very important topic of reading every day, hearing Prabhupada's words, and nourishing ourselves. But thank you once again, Maharaj, for your time.
Thank you.
I'm really grateful.
Doing this wonderful service to inspire everyone to read Srila Prabhupada's books.
Maharaj, you have definitely inspired us a lot in what you've shared with us today. You've basically shaken a lot of false pillars that we base our unhealthy reading habits on. You just come as a soldier from the field, as they call it, and you just brought it down with your artillery of your realizations of Srimad Bhagavatam. All glories to Srila Prabhupada and all glories to Srila Prabhupada's transcendental books.
Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrindi ki jai. Hare.
Thank you. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.